if we survive this conflict, then after this conflict, there will be a totally new world order without any single global superpower, any single real dominant power in the world. That's where we are heading.
We can almost feel it, can't we? The tension tightening across the globe. America is steering towards a direct confrontation with China, and Europe, whether by conviction or simply blind obedience, is following the same path with Russia. Let's look at the behavior. Trade restrictions, fleet deployments, sanctions framed as deterrence but acting as provocations. Each move described as defensive, yet outcome pushes the threshold closer to open conflict. There's no single declaration, no sudden rupture, just a slow normalization of escalation until something snaps. And here's the thing, most people still treat it like background noise. They scroll past headlines about security realignments or strategic competition, as if those phrases didn't mean lives, economies, or the end of the global order as we know it. The language itself, sterile. It hides the magnitude of what's shifting underneath our very feet. If the signs are written on the wall, read them, because they are there in plain sight, in the way supply chains get militarized, in the way alliances harden, in the way friendshoring replaces globalization, as if this weren't just a polite synonym for fragmentation. One person who reads those signs clearly is the former Hungarian ambassador to China, Sandor Kusai. He's been there, inside the machinery of diplomacy, watching the tectonic plates move from up close. And he doesn't speak in slogans. He speaks in cause and effect, in consequence. The conversation you're about to hear, well, it's not meant to reassure. It's meant to confront a kind of collective amnesia. The West keeps talking about defending order and shared values. But the order it's defending doesn't exist anymore, and neither are the shared values. The unipolar moment is gone. The world has tilted, and much of the West refuses to admit that. That's why I wrote a full exposé on Substack that investigates the full scope of America's war preparation against China. The strategy, the roadmap, the military bases in the Philippines, the money flow, the timelines, and all the sources. If you have ever wondered how empires talk themselves into coalitions they can't afford, this is the moment to look closely. Because beneath the slogans and the moral posturing, America isn't defending peace. It's engineering a future that requires an enemy to exist. Read the article, sit with it. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comments. And you don't have to agree, just don't look away. Ambassador Kusai, what a pleasure having you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I have, as always in my interviews, I did a little research in regards to your person, and I'm especially interested because you're a China specialist in the very true sense of the word. So I see here that your entire career is oriented around the Sino-Hungarian relations and China-Asia diplomacy in general. And I have a couple of functions in next to me here. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah? I don't want to
You are totally right. I spent the last 45 years with dealing with China, studying China, and 30 years out of that managing the Hungarian-Chinese cooperation and relations in diplomatic field.
Okay, and you started very early. So you were at the beginning desk officer for China at the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then you served at the Hungarian embassy in Beijing as assistant attaché, and as third secretary. Then head of the China desk in Budapest, first secretary, then deputy chief of mission at the Hungarian embassy in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Then deputy head at the Hungarian embassy in Beijing, and then deputy director general and diplomatic advisor in the prime minister's office in Hungary, and finally ambassador of Hungary to the Chinese Republic in China until, also from 2008 till 2014.
2014.
Yes. And since your political career, you are listed as a lecturer and researcher as China specialist. No surprise here. That's quite an amazing career, ambassador. I mean, I don't want to dive in right away, but what's the most pivotal moment that you experienced yourself in any of those locations and functions?
It's I would say the most pivotal moment was in 2003 when Hungary, just before joining the European Union, began the Eastern opening, China opening policy, and we switched from just being a small Central European country to be a country which tries to cooperate very substantively with China. I think that was that moment, and I took a part of that process, considerable part, I would say, in that process. So the pivotal moment was 2003.
Yeah. And you are in that very true sense, I said already, a rare eyewitness to decades of Chinese diplomacy and Western antagonism. And this is a theme that we will come back to. And speaking of which, antagonism. Yeah, so I interviewed a month ago a former BBC producer who was basically silenced for not being as critical as she was expected to be by the BBC. So there's no longer Anna Chen is no longer on the BBC. And if I may mention it, I wrote an article about America's preparation to a hot war with China. And the former ambassador, the former foreign minister, apologies, of Malta, read my article, and I interviewed him in Malta 3 weeks ago. Yeah. So there are serious concerns on diplomatic levels that America, is not only doing as if, yeah, bluffing, but is actually preparing for hot war with China. What's your take on this?
First of all, just to reflect of your points. First, I was lucky because in Hungary we never had any pressure to be unrealistic on China. So I was lucky, not like the mentioned editor in BBC, that I was lucky because nobody ever pressured me to evaluate or to manage Chinese relations or evaluate China differently than I thought as objective assessment. So it's a very good thing because reality is always very complex. You shall not serve, especially not in diplomacy, in practical foreign policy. You shall never follow any narrative. You must be on the real evaluation of real things, and you must have your brain capacity free of any prejudice. That's the key element for that. First element. Second is that I agree fully with the present assessment that there is a very grave risk that we may slip into a hot war between the US and China. I think there are limiting factors or postponing factors for that matter. There are a lot of international, global, and regional circumstances which cause simply that no hot war has begun yet. But there is no guarantee for the future, at least for the foreseeable few years, that we don't slip into a serious conflict. The danger is there. I think we can still avoid it, but the preparation on both sides for a serious conflict is going on and speeding up. I agree with that.
The overall global situation with 55 hot wars at the moment, two of which are more or less in the news, that's Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, Russia. You would think, the global leaders would have the hands full already. And now they're actively trying to engage with China, where I like to, use this analogy from a declining empire, that's America, and a rising dragon, and that's China. Would it be a fair depiction?
I would not oversimplify that issue. I think first of all, I was the first Hungarian analyst in Hungary who wrote an article in a Hungarian research journal about the new Cold War. It was in the summer of 2021. I assessed the situation that we are at that time that we entered the new Cold War. I am convinced that we are in the phase of new Cold War. And this period, like the previous, the first Cold War, is characterized by many local conflicts, including very serious and very dangerous military conflicts, as you mentioned, in West Asia, the Middle East, Gaza, so the whole one complex, and in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. But we have a lot of more conflicts going on or at the early phases, and this characterizes the new Cold War situation. And the major or the most dangerous players or participants in this new Cold War are three great powers, three superpowers: the US, Russia, and China. And what we see now, I am convinced that it is a preparatory phase for switching from Cold War to hot war, but it's very dangerous because the the comprehension or understanding of this whole situation is still within the framework of bipolar world, which is not good, not appropriate. It is not simply an outgoing empire or global power and an incoming global power. I think the process is much more complicated because we are on the verge of a global situation. If we can avoid, of course, the Third World War, because if we cannot avoid, then nothing to talk about, then there is nothing to talk about anymore. But if we can avoid a new World War, then the change is much bigger than for the last 500-600 years, when one global power changed the other global power, and the transition was very dangerous during that time, because we are now on the brink of a new situation when there is no global dominant power. And that is the difference. The US fights for keeping its global dominance, its global hegemony. China, at least it looks like China is aiming or working or fighting for eliminating the situation of any single global dominant power. The Chinese want to change this whole situation. They truly want to have polycentricity or multipolarity. And that's why this conflict or confrontation is much more complex. We are on the verge of ending a whole few hundred years long period of human history where we had dominant powers, globally dominant powers. We are on the verge of ending that phase of history. And this present Sino-US competition or confrontation is about that. That's why it's something new, which is very difficult to analyze because we don't have good historical examples to help us to understand this confrontation fully. That is my opinion, and I think there will be, after, if we survive this conflict, then after this conflict, there will be a totally new world order without any single global superpower, any single real dominant power in the world. That's where we are heading.
You're absolutely right. We are at the tail end of 500 to 600 years of Western dominance over the world, and that's a completely new situation. The powers to be, of course, they try to extend their periods of hegemonic power. I mean, we, the West, let's say NATO, 16% of the population, of the world's population, try to exploit basically at gunpoint. If you look at the example of Hong Kong, exploit on gunpoint the rest of the world. And this situation is now changing. So you just said, in regards to the new Cold War. So when you say if you survive the conflict, do you mean the actual hot war as a conflict, or you mean the kind of Cold War situation conflict to survive?
I don't think we can avoid the Cold War. The Cold War is already going on. So
Yeah.
it must be fought. The Cold War must be fought. There is no other choice. That's what we see in the economic front between China and the United States and the Western European Union, the Western powers and other powers all over the world. Pressure on India, whatever you want to see, that's an economic Cold War. That is ongoing now. What I meant, if we can avoid, is not the Cold War. If we can avoid this Cold War to turn into a global, real hot war, the World War III, which is really in the very close danger. If we can avoid that, because if there is a new world war, as you said in the opening question, whether we are heading for a military conflict between the United States and China, that is the major question. Or if we're heading for a direct military conflict between the United States and Russia. In both cases, we will have the Third World War, which will end the human history. So if we can avoid that via fighting the Cold War or fighting the process of the Cold War. The Cold War is always a long process. The world wars are always short, a few years, 5, 6. And there is a clear winner after a world war. After a Cold War, we may have more winners, but the process is very long. It takes decades. And now we are only at the beginning of a Cold War. So it is very risky. We cannot avoid the Cold War confrontation, the Cold War type confrontation. I think what we can still avoid is a new world war, the Third World War. That is the Third World War. That is still possible to avoid it. It will be difficult. It's not simple. As you mentioned, my colleague, ambassador or foreign minister of Malta, said that we are preparing for the possibility, the United States is preparing for the possibility of fighting a direct war with China. The similar goes on in Ukraine. The US prepares itself and Europe especially, for getting involved directly in the war. So the danger of slipping into a real physical, as the military scientists say, kinetic war, it's still possible, and it's growing. The danger is growing. But if we can avoid it, we will have a longer confrontation, a longer fight between great powers, mainly, during which they use different tools, different spheres, economy, ideology, propaganda, diplomacy, even the local or the localized military conflicts, which you mentioned, there are 50 something now going on. Those are also tools of the Cold War. They are also signs of we are in the Cold War. And it's also tools for fighting the Cold War, but those are tools which may help avoid a single direct military conflict between the two sides, the Western world, if you want, and the Eastern, Southern world of humanity. That's my assessment of the situation.
You just mentioned Russia. So the preparation for war with Russia, this specific war over Ukraine, goes back at least to 2014, probably much longer. And we know this from, Victoria Nuland, F the EU. I'm not speaking out the word that she said. And if you think about Brzezinski, I think it was in 1998 already, he warned about, in his book, The Great Chess Game, he warned about driving Russia in the arms of China. And they interviewed US Ambassador Charles Freeman. He said, we, the Americans, were even more stupid. We even entered a nuclear-armed North Korea into the mix to make it even more dangerous. Yeah. So with the current administration in the US, do you have any feeling what their inclination is in regards to a confrontation with China? Because also the preparation for the confrontation with China is not a recent thing. It's already in the making for multiple years.
It's very difficult to assess the real endeavors or real strategic goals of the present American administration because it is not clear what they want, and it is really very messy sometimes what they are doing. It's clear that they want to preserve the global dominance of the United States, not only in military, political, geopolitical terms, but also in economic terms, in technology, in the field of technologies, and so on. The purpose or the aim is very clear, but it is very difficult to assess the operative level or the tactical level of their actions, because I don't think they fully understand the complexity of the challenge they face. For example, the trade war between the US and China. We had, I think, 3 waves of that trade war for the last 8 months. The first was the very big tariffs. Then it was cut back because of the Chinese counter pressure. And then we saw this sanction, the secondary sanction type of trade war, and the gradual limitation, the slicing salami tactics in the technology sphere by the US. And the US administration, it seems to me, got surprised that the Chinese hit back. They dared to hit back. This is the issue of the rare earths limitation, of the special magnets limitation. And the US administration, for some reason, I don't know which, because I'm not in the specialist in the American governance affairs, but they did not, or they did not estimate well the readiness of China to hit back and the vulnerability of the American economy to those Chinese countermeasures. And now we are again, for the last few days, again on the verge of new round of trade war, or the new escalation of trade war with regard to different new tariffs, sanctions, counter sanctions, and other limitations. So it's very difficult, just in some elements a tactical game, or whether it is really a strong preparation for having a kinetic military conflict, a real direct military conflict. It is possible both ways. We shall see how it develops. But I am convinced that until the US cannot finish its involvement in Ukraine and in the Middle East, it is impossible to begin the forward direct military conflict with a very complex maneuvering when the US is trying to at least to put a hold on the Middle Eastern conflict. And now we saw an attempt to put a hold on the Ukraine conflict, which was not successful. At least at present, it seems that it is not successful. But just to relieve the American forces needed for the direct conflict with China. I mean the military conflict. And until then, before, as a kind of preparation, the American side is working very hard to soften China economically, technologically, financially, all kinds of pressure exercised on China in that field. It is the aim to limit or to diminish China's capacity to prepare for a military conflict. And one more addition to that, I fully agree with whoever said, with my colleague ambassador, when he said that we, the Western world, the NATO, after all, we Hungarians are members of the NATO, which many people always forget, but we are there. So we, in the Western world, mainly the United States, but also its allies, were really foolish enough to force together Russia, China, North Korea even, and
Iran.
Of course Iran, and we lost, or we are very close to lose, India as well. So it's simply, I think, an overreach, overestimation of our capacities. But I may be wrong. Maybe at the end, after a few years of this conflict or confrontation, maybe we will come out from this stronger. But at this moment, it seems that we are getting weaker and weaker, and the camp which we pressured together gets stronger and stronger.
There are a number of incidences that seem to me that we, the West, NATO, America, are leading, shooting us in our own foot. One example, and I'm really specifically interested on your view here, one example is the so-called explosions of the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, I've discussed this with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, with Noam Chomsky, with the whole string. I even discussed it with a former Boeing engineer who financed the only private expedition down to the actual sites of the implosion. Yeah, everybody is clear, directly or indirectly. The US, and not to mention, not to forget Seymour Hersh's article, where he in detail outlines what he thinks happened, which is, I think, the closest version of the truth that we have. Yeah. So for Europe, this was an amazing impact. So people talk about the deindustrialization of Germany based on that single fact alone, the loss of cheap Russian gas. Now that to me, and I mean, I still see this interview. There was Biden, Scholz, German chancellor, was next to him. And Biden said something, I promise you, we're going to make it happen. And there was a female journalist from Reuters. She was so puzzled by this answer that she asked him, so, sorry, Mr. President, how do you envision this? This is a German-Russian project. I promise you, we will make it happen. So this goes way back. Now, from a European perspective, the consequences, and I'm sitting here in the Netherlands, the consequences are Europe-wide. Yeah, and China, half a year ago, signed a 50-year contract now with Russia to get the gas that Europe no longer takes, right? So these kind of self-harming exercises, is this not a paradox?
It is a paradox. I agree with you, but you shall take into account the strategic concept of the decision makers who made these, I almost said stupid, but I don't use such words, who made these, I would say, incorrect decisions, to remain diplomatic in my language. So there is a calculation in their head that we will win this confrontation. So we don't need this Nord Stream pipeline. There is permanently a threat against the South Stream pipeline, which goes via Turkey and comes up to Hungary, by the way, with the Russian gas, and now to Slovakia even. So there is always a danger that that will be blown up, because part of that pipeline goes under the Black Sea. So anyhow, the issue is that you would think that this shooting ourselves in the foot, especially shooting the German economy into foot, was an irrational act, but it was not irrational. I can say that there may be a calculation which may give a rational basis for that decision, and that calculation is that we will defeat Russia soon, militarily, have a regime change in Russia, divide Russia into 6, 7 or more independent countries. Then we will send our military to the gas fields and oil fields in Russia as guarantors of security. We will have a German general commanding the northern gas fields of Russia, a French general commanding the oil fields near the Caspian Sea, and so on. And then with cheap Russian labor, with cheap Russian technology, we will rebuild whatever we want and get very cheap, almost zero priced gas, oil, and so on from Russia, so we can reindustrialize Europe, whatever we want. That was, I think, the basic strategic calculation. It seems at present that this was a mistaken calculation. There is no real choice to defeat Russia strategically, to carve up Russia into a few states, although our good European chief diplomat, Madam Kaja Kallas, still repeats that idea. So it means that some leaders of Europe still think in those terms. So, and I would say the unintended consequence of this political strategy, or this energy strategy, if you want, is that Russia turned its energy exports to China, to India, to other countries. And another delicate element of this strategic blunder, I would say, was that what happened in reality, please think about it. The oil-producing countries, the OPEC, headed by Saudi Arabia, and the OPEC plus, the plus countries headed by Russia, at the early stages of the Ukraine war, simply agreed to switch markets between them. Most of the Middle East oil now comes to Europe. Most of the Russian oil goes to Asia. Before the war, it was just the opposite. We had Russian oil, Russian gas in Europe, and the Middle Eastern oil and gas went to China, Japan, India. What we, I think, miscalculated the European leaders in that process is that those energy producing countries can talk to each other and they simply can switch their markets with each other. And now we are stuck with more expensive gas, more expensive oil, because it's objectively must be more expensive because the transportation is more costly via sea and so on. So we are stuck with it, and our, I would say, rivals, as the European Union calls China a rival in official documents, our rivals are heading for cheaper energy, gas and oil, transported via pipelines from Russia, which gives it a big competitive advantage in industry and other things. Because please don't forget that the decline, the deindustrialization of Germany happened not simply because of the cut-off energy, the cheap energy, but also because of the competition of the Chinese industries, which are using the same cheap energy. So it gave them extra competitive edge. And so we simply did not shoot only one foot of ours. We managed to shoot both feet.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah. Very well put. Because you mentioned Kaya Kallas, I wrote an article about unelected officials, like specifically Kaya Kallas, who drive Europe into in a hot war with Russia. But coming back very briefly, and we don't have to elaborate, but very briefly, I cannot resist to ask you one more thing about the Nord Stream pipelines. A two-pronged question. You are a diplomat. You are internationally connected, especially to China. I would be really interested to kind of get a feel what the Hungarian government, but more interestingly, what the Chinese government internally think who is behind the Nord Stream attacks.
Don't know, because I retired from diplomacy about 10 years ago, so I am not directly connected to them at present. So I don't read the classified internet documents. I don't have it. But as far as I can assess the official statements of the Hungarian government and the official statements coming from China, I think everybody clearly understands that it is the US and Britain who are behind the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. By the way, the present Polish foreign minister, Mr. Sikorski, at that time when he was a member of the European Parliament, even published, I think it was on X or Facebook, where he simply thanked America for this act. So
thank you, USA. That's exactly the words he wrote.
It's clear who did it. No matter, I think from political or diplomatic or strategic point of view, it's not important. No matter whether the concrete executioners of that act were Ukrainian, Polish, whoever did it. In diplomacy or foreign policy, I am convinced you shall always follow the good Roman principle and put up the question, cui prodest, cui bono? It is good for whom, whose interest it serves, and then it comes very clearly, very openly, the answer. I think the Chinese think the same way. It seems to me, reading analytical articles from Chinese scholars, that everybody knows very clearly that behind that blow were leading Western powers, the Anglosphere powers, if you want to put it that way. That's why, by the way, all the Chinese projects, energy projects with Russia, the new ones especially, are about building pipelines directly or as much as possible directly between Russia and China, and not on the sea, if possible, avoiding third countries where nobody can interfere with the pipelines. The Siberia Force 1 is going directly from Russia to China. The Siberia Force 2, which they are planning to build, will go via Mongolia, but Mongolia is a landlocked country between Russia and China. So more or less, strategically, they can control the whole pipeline. There are more complicated issues with the other pipelines between Russia and China, because many of them go through countries of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and so on. And there already strategic risks. Nobody can fully control whether some third countries cannot interfere with that. That's why I think it's very clear. The same goes, by the way, with the Far Eastern Russian LNG projects, because even the shipping lines from the Far East of Russia can go relatively safe to China. So they shall not go around the whole world. That's why all the focus of these countries on the direct link, because they drew the strategic conclusion from the fate of the Nord Stream pipeline.
Absolutely.
They simply drew the strategic conclusion out of that situation.
Yeah. Now, if you turn this around and have a look at the let's have a look at Brics, the Petro Dollar, and the Shanghai Gold Exchange that China. I mean, I know I throw too much now in there, but it's related. Yeah, maybe we start. I mean, everybody knows about the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, this kind of new Silk Road. What's less known, because it's relatively new, and also for me it was new before I started to research, is that basically China, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So my interpretation is that China might try to peg the yuan to gold, which is why they have now the new Shanghai Gold Exchange. They are creating gold exchanges around the world in order to make, to avoid the same mistake that America did in, what was it, 1971, when Nixon kind of cut the gold standard, so the dollar from the gold, basically. Yeah. So the petrodollar, very briefly, I mean, I don't have to explain to you how absolutely important, crucial the petrodollar is for America. If the petrodollar dies or even severely weakens, there will be no 11 supercarrier groups on the oceans of this planet. So the petrodollar is the lifeblood of America, which is why Trump is so outspoken. Anyone getting off of the dollar will no longer be able to trade with America, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. But in the background, we have Brics now actively trying on multiple fronts. There's a substitute for SWIFT, and now I mean, China, I saw the statistics, I probably put it in when I edit this video, is the largest gold buyer on this planet, and it went exponential. It's exponential, right? So there is something in the making. So what can you tell us about it?
First, about the gold and Chinese renminbi or yuan. We don't know how much gold China has in its reserves. Because there are official data which they provide for the IMF and other international financial organizations. That's very nice. But I have the suspicion that the amount of gold in Chinese reserves is at least 2 times as much as they officially announce, or even maybe more. That frenzy, how China buys gold and stockpiles it, it makes suspicion that it is much more. And by that, I want to turn your attention to that. There were a few years ago, 2 years ago, there was a very big international hype about the Brics creating a new currency or whatever, or the Chinese yuan becomes the new global currency. I think it was a total misunderstanding of the situation, or if not, an American narrative planted into the international discussions, because I don't see any sign of anybody wanting to create a new currency instead of the US dollar. We have the new reserve currency. It is the old reserve currency. It's called gold. No need to create anything new. It showed for thousands of years that the gold standard, the gold basis is working, full stop. So what I see in the Brics, or in these new developments in trading gold, as you mentioned, it is, I think, just a technical element, how to turn the gold into a new currency, or the old gold basis for financial mechanism regain its strength. You mentioned gold exchange in Shanghai. I can turn your attention to the reciprocal move in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to create a gold deposit there as well. So what is happening is a gradual process. It won't happen overnight, but it's the gradual process of establishing the petrogold, if you want to say, instead of the petrodollar. The Chinese are amassing gold. The oil-producing countries are amassing gold. There is a possible simple transfer, I mean electronic transfer of rights to gold for oil, in avoidance of any dollar payment, even in avoidance of yuan payments. So we are moving, it's a very complex process. I don't think we know the final result yet. There are different ways and avenues to change the global financial system, and which one will be more successful, we will see after a few years. But the process, even in the sphere of petrodollar, even in the sphere of reserve currencies, even in the sphere of payments, trade payments in different currencies, these different processes, even in the Brics idea of creating a new international financial mechanism which will deal with cross-border payments and so on, it is going on there. So there are a lot of different avenues where the financial world is changing. I agree with you that with the decline of the petrodollar, automatically the American military capacity and political capacity also declines. That's why Donald Trump is so angry. But the last few months showed very clearly that his anger does not move hills, does not move walls. He got angry, put high tariff on China, then the Chinese said, sorry, you don't have rare earth magnets, so he backed up from the tariffs and so on. So he may be angry. It's very respectable thing to be angry, but the result is very limited. And going to the last element, what you mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is changing. We are in the phase of changing the Belt and Road Initiative. Originally, it was a concept for rewiring economically the Afro-Euro-Asian supercontinent. It's one supercontinent which holds the most of the human resources, the natural resources, the technological capacities, the financial capacities of the world, of the humanity. Originally, in 2013, within the framework of globalization, it was planned to exert a new center within this economic net. It should be China, because traditionally the globalization of the economy was US and Western European centered. It is, let's say, the remains of the colonial system. Every road led to Rome. It's an exaggeration. To Paris, to Berlin, to London, and to Washington. Every road led there. What the Chinese began is to build new roads, if you want, symbolically, ports, even investments into industries, into infrastructure, which were centered over China, over Beijing. Some roads had to lead to Beijing, if you want this formula. Nowadays, when we see that this complex economic war with the US from the Chinese side, the increasing economic war between China and the European Union, we are moving into a phase of economic war. Many people want to deny it, but that is the reality. We are moving into economic war. Just today, the European Union approved the 19th sanction package against Russia, which includes very strong sanctions against Chinese and Indian companies which cooperate with Russia. So we are moving into an economic war with China as well. So with that under those new circumstances, the Belt and Road Initiative's character and strategic aims must change. There is an unavoidable change in that. For a long time, it was creating the communications between Europe and China. Now it must focus on Africa, on Middle East, on Southeast Asia, and Europe must have lost its importance in the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative becomes more and more a strategic tool for reorganizing the global South, not to reconnect with the global North, the West, but to reorganize economically the global South, the whole structure, to create a workable structure for China's economy to connect with markets in the global South, to develop the markets, the capacities of the global South, and so on. That's what we see, and part of it, by the way, this creation of new centers for trade of gold, for the elements of a new multifaceted financial system, not simply based on dollars, but many other things, technologically as well, the payment mechanism outside SWIFT, and so on. It's a very complicated, complex process. Part of it is the Belt and Road Initiative, its new directions, and many what we just talked about are part of this complicated process. we don't see the final result yet, but I told you, Cold Wars last decades. So we are at the beginning. So why would we expect to know the final result? It's impossible to know. We are in the process, even at the beginning of this process. That is my assessment.
Agree. We are at the beginning of this massive change that's coming. Yeah. Now, in regards to Europe, so I think it was Ursula von der Leyen. I heard her say that we have to get used, Europe has to get used to only trade with a basket. That's her word, a basket of friends, I believe she said. Yeah. Now, how is that supposed to work? I mean, on a realistic level. I mean, not even this. Let's say the basket she is referring to, let's say, is NATO, the NATO states. These states don't have everything Europe needs or everything they themselves need amongst each other. So on a practical level, how? Yeah, talking about another example of shooting in the foot, you mentioned SWIFT, the weaponization of money. Is it not a logical consequence that if one power bloc weaponizes the international payment system, that the rest of the world will logically try to circumvent it and build an alternative? These kind of things. So and Europe is deeply involved, and you in Hungary, you are in the in the center now of Europe. So well, Europe is a this old, how shall I say it? Europe is also an empire, colonial empire, not in Europe itself, but even the Belgium, a small country, had a colony in Congo, these kind of things. Huh? Netherlands, right? I mean, they had massive colonies, right? The wealth of the Netherlands goes back to that time. So now we are facing a Europe that has to deal with a complex situation, to use your diplomatic terminology, a complex situation. But again, I see left and right. I'm inclined to say bluntly stupidity, yeah. But in your diplomatic language, mistakes being made by self-harming the European or Western interests by blindly following the US. And I see that countries like yours, Hungary, and I'm not specifically aiming at a specific administration, that's not what I'm doing, have sometimes a more lucid view on the situation than core countries, Northern European countries. Why is that?
First of all, there is just answering the last question. For Hungary, it's a very simple issue. Our history is different from the core Western European countries' history. Our people has a totally different historical experience, evaluation of history. We are on the crossroads of the East, the South, and the West. And for the last 600 years, we were always on the losing end of this story, beginning from the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. We always lost. We joined the war. It was guaranteed that we will end up on the losing side. By the way, it's again an old Hungarian saying: when Hungary joins alliance, that alliance is doomed to fail. I don't go further on that line because we joined both NATO and the European Union. So you can think about this. I would say it's a half joke, but what really happened, we joined the Warsaw Pact, it failed. We joined the Comecon economic bloc, it failed. We joined or organized the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it broke up. We joined Germany in the First World War, we lost. So anyhow, that's, if you want, a thing. So we have a different historical experience, which for many people in Hungary, not everybody, but for many people, and for the present government, it clearly means that we must open must be open to every direction. We must have capacity or outreach to the east, to the west, to the south, to everywhere, because that is the only guarantee for a small Central European country in this geographical, geopolitical location to have development. Have, first of all, peace, because that is the precondition of every development. Then economic, social development. You must utilize all the possibilities. So that's the basic policy. And you may criticize it. Many people talk about personal relations of Mr. Orban with Putin, with Xi Jinping, with everybody. Those are just the narratives. You don't take that into account. It's about interests and historic experiences of the whole nation. So that's one element. The second element which I want to turn your attention is a very important term coming from the ancient Greek philosophy and literature. It is called hubris. That's what you see when our good, almost empress, the first empress of Europe, Madame Ursula von der Leyen, says about the basket, whom we shall trade and cooperate. It's unrealistic. It's hubris in that sense that we can force other parts of the world to cooperate with us on our terms, giving all the benefits to us. That's why the European Union 19th sanction package sanctions Chinese companies, Indian companies, whoever. We think that we can dictate the terms of trade to China, to India, to everybody else. It's hubris. It's not realistic. And to trade or cooperate economically only with a, let's say, basket, so with the limited numbers of countries, it's again economic or policy or strategic hubris. We cannot live economically, socially, we cannot manage our societies without interacting with the rest of the world. You know, it's very simple because Europe, during the first few hundred years of industrialization, simply used up all of its natural resources. Steel, coal, oil, gas, and so on. We have an industrial development of about 400, 500 years. And we used up what is in the soils in the European continent, which is, and that's it. So, and if you want to continue to exist economically, you must import the basic natural resources. And of course, you must trade. So you must produce something and sell your product, even if it is services, but mainly the material products. You must sell to the others to buy the resources from them. The hubris parties of this concept of Madame Ursula is that we can force on the rest of the world our terms of this economic exchange. We cannot do that anymore. We could in Europe could do that, let's say 50 or 60 years ago. Now it's impossible. But the whole idea is, I would say, it is a result of, I don't use again that bad word, stupidity. I will use dysfunctional thinking. This is a very diplomatic way of putting that. Dysfunctional thinking of a dysfunctional mechanism or construct which is called European Union. It's a dysfunctional construct. It does not work well. It does not serve the interest of the European peoples, of the European economy anymore. It's dysfunctional. It does not work normally. So it created or produced this whole concept of Europe living in its own world and dictated the terms to the others. As, by the way, as one of the vassals of the US. Because after all, it's even not an empire, because there is another empire which the European part is only part of it, as Japan and South Korea are part of it, as Australia is part of it. We are one of the subordinate vassals of the United States empire, if you want, and we still have the hubris to dictate to the other world. That's simply dysfunctional, put it mildly and diplomatically.
I think you said it very well. We, also Europe, is a vassal of America, and people have no inclination on how deep that really goes. I mean, in Germany alone, you have more than 50,000 US soldiers, so-called, to shield Europe from the Russians. The same is true I think in Okinawa alone has, I believe, 30,000 or 40,000 soldiers. It's massive. Yeah. So we have 750 official US bases around the globe and 150 unofficial bases around the world. And all of them, no, 90% of them are this iron grip around China and Russia. So that's clearly a sign of an empire. And Europe is, I mean, there are countless, so many examples of how that vassalship manifests itself from the media, yeah, if it still can call it like that, the so-called, free media in the West. Now, whenever I talk about the media in the West, then I often get the comments from a few, because in Russia or in China, the media is so free. That's not the point. The point is that in Russia and to some extent in China, and I come back to you on that, but especially in Russia, people knew and know that they're not being sold the truth, right? But here in the West, the people have the illusion that there is no propaganda. Whilst in the West, the propaganda, and I'm saying this as a behavior analyst, I've studied this, the propaganda here in the West is far more sophisticated and all-pervasive. I've written and spoken about this many times. So there is this big gap, and this is where I would like to come back to you, because you have lived in China. So here in the West, China is portrayed as this. Maybe I should take one step back. So China is a collectivist society. Here in the West, we are an individualist society. Those are fundamental differences. But here in the West, China is portrayed as a dictatorial state. So here in the West, we are hearing, China is the bad entity, and here in the West, we are in the heaven of freedom. So you have lived there. What's the reality on the ground?
First of all, just to face the reality, there is no national social scoring system in China. It's the invention of the Western propaganda. Full stop. We have quite a few such inventions in our Western media describing China. The Chinese society is much more complex than we see in the press, in the media in the West. It's true that it is a more collectivist society. It has its own old, 4,000 years old value system, which is evolving, changing, and operating today rather successfully, I would say. Of course, there are always social conflicts, conflicts, ideological conflicts, even political debates in China, but the Chinese population more or less understands and knows what is going on. The Chinese population can read the media, their own media, very clearly. They understand it, what is covered there, and there even the opposition is covered. Just you must learn to read it. In our societies, there is a big, big contradiction. By the way, in the newest technologies, the Chinese media, the Chinese social cultural life is much more sophisticated than we think. The Chinese are not less connected to digital platforms than we. They are more connected. They have more information on the internet available for them than there is for us. Even their propaganda is more sophisticated than ours. It's terrible, but we shall recognize that. In Europe, partially in the US, we are always convinced that we are the most sophisticated in information technology, in media, in communicating our messages, but where we are very clearly very sophisticated is the sphere of spreading lies, misinformation. Everybody or not everybody, but most of the people in our societies are convinced that the traditional media, that the mainstream media conveys the truth, conveys the debates, gives space for debating opposing opinions. It's not true anymore. In some respect, we are moving towards the approach to freedom of information, which is very characteristic in North Korea. In China, there is very few sources of information which are blocked totally by the state. Very few. In our European societies, basically all of the Russian information is blocked.
Totally.
It is very difficult for me as a researcher or as a scholar to follow via internet the different opinions in Russia, because it's very difficult to reach out and read something or see something, what is going on in Russia in reality. The similar situation is growing with China. It's very difficult to get information primary sourced from China. I mean from Chinese sources, my God. What you can get is the report of the correspondent of Reuters. But the guy is anti-China hand for the last 40 years. Why shall we trust his opinion? So the issue is that we are getting closer to a closed circle information or narrative circulation, which is created for us by our good political leaders. That's the big problem for us, because it limits our real debates on politics, even on economics. You very rarely can read in Europe or see on the internet the real debates about the basic issues of economic science. For example, whether the calculation of gross domestic product, GDP, is right or is it wrong? Tell me the NATO has, I think, officially, I think 15 or more times larger GDP than Russia. And we are fighting via Ukraine with Russia for more than 3.5 years. How does it come that we have not won yet? There must be some problem with the tool of measurement. The GDP calculation is not good. The Russians produce 3 times as many tanks and other weapons than we in the whole Western world. Why is our GDP so big and they're so small? I want to turn your attention that there are methodological problems, scientific problems. Same goes with all the narratives, the information freedom, and we are not allowed to debate it. It's simply very difficult to see alternative concepts of GDP. You cannot find it even in economic science. Not for the public. For the public, you cannot find any alternative idea for politics, for military issues, or for cultural issues, or anything. Except I must tell you that we have a little bit more freedom of information in Hungary. What is in the hands of Brussels, the European Union, that may limit our concept. So Google has stopped the Russian content. So we cannot reach it in Hungary as well. But many other media sites we can reach here because it is allowed, which is in the sphere of decision of the Hungarian government. We can reach that. Which is in the sphere of decision-making of the European Union, they can block us. So in relative terms, in getting information from around the world, from the rest of the world, if you want, we are in luckier position than, let's say, our good friends in Austria or in the Netherlands, because we can get a little bit more information. That's a strange thing, which makes Europe, and if you calculate that the major narrative production center in the world is in the US. So what we talked about, the geopolitical, economical, and other servitude of Europe to the US, in the sphere of information, of media, it's even bigger. Because the production of values, of art, of concepts, of narratives comes from the US. There is very little own production of ideas in Germany. Just 30 years ago, there was a German philosophy, schools of German philosophy. Where are they? They are non-existent. The same if you check the mainstream media. Germany, France, even the big countries. In smaller countries, most of the companies of the mainstream media has been bought by the Americans and international firms or international conglomerates long ago. But even the bigger countries, the greater European powers, they also lost their media independence. That's what the situation is. So we shall live within that situation, and there is only one solution. What I can suggest to everybody, whoever sees this conversation, what we have, use your own brain. That is so simple. When you see a big contradiction, the NATO's GDP is 15, 30 times higher than Russia, then please think about how is it that we haven't really defeated them yet. There must be some problem with the measurement. The same for every concrete question, every issue. Please use your own brain, and then you will see through some narratives, propaganda, or you may call it as you want.
If you allow me, I have a very concrete example in regards to so-called free press in a surprising country, New Zealand. There is a female journalist in New Zealand, Susie Dawson. I interviewed her like 2 weeks ago. She had to flee to Russia. You cannot believe this. She investigated New Zealand Secret Service. Apparently, they illegally spied and still spy on their own population. And then they outsourced this spying to the FBI. There was a specific raid in New Zealand. And you really have to picture this. This was filmed by reporters where the FBI agents had uniforms on. They all had the very exact same IDs on it. Yeah, so to this level. But the point is, she and her family were terrorized, and there is no other word for it. So that she now has to live in exile in Russia, where she feels freer than in New Zealand. Yeah. So this is only one example of the twisted world this is one example of many in regards to how the narratives are controlled. And this leads me to my next question. And I know I throw you in the cold water now, but are you aware of NATO's cognitive warfare program?
No, thanks God, I have no specific idea on it. I can imagine that under such a name, such a code name, what can exist? Of course, but concretely, I don't know this program. But on the level of the present day, social sciences, biological, psychological sciences, I can imagine very developed methodologies, tools to influence people, even such tools which we average ordinary people even cannot imagine. I think there are such things. Whether they are used and how effective they are, I don't know. But what I see is that the manipulation manipulation of individuals, groups of individuals, communities, and whole societies is a very delicate and very professional matter which is going on. Again, I think there is only one tool or one way to try to keep your own freedom is simply use your brain, use your own logical, analytical capacities. And then you will have, let's say, 40% chance to remain free. Not 50, only 30, 40. But it's also more than 0%.
Imagine Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. The whole world's media said Russia did it. Russia blew up their own multi-billion-dollar project. People don't realize they're not just some steel pipes on the bottom of the sea. This is high tech. They are nano-coated on molecular level so that not a single oxygen molecule can mix with the gas. This is a fantastic project. Yeah, but Russia blew it. So we were told, and to a large extent, many people believed it for a long time. Russia. So coming back to what you said, use your own brain. Yeah. Even though the unified Western media, owned by a handful of large corporations, tell you otherwise.
The brainwashing is a highly developed business. I think partially the new methodology, the new techniques of brainwashing are produced by appropriate government organizations, secret services, armies, militaries, and so on. Partially, they are produced by companies. they are developed by companies, transnational corporations, media companies,
Twitter,
internet
Facebook, yes.
companies. Yes, that's it. But it's the reality. We shall live in this world. So the only solution is keep your logical thinking and use your own brain. Don't rely on other people's brain, because that may be misleading, saying diplomatically.
Ambassador Kusai, it was my pleasure. No, before we conclude, one last thing. We kind of covered quite a broad spectrum of topics. Is there anything that's close to your heart that we have not discussed? Anything at all?
No, I think we discussed everything which today is in my mind, or where my analytical work is going around. More or less discussed everything.
Good. Then there remains nothing else than for me being very grateful for your time and for your wisdom. Thank you very much for joining me on this little discussion.
Thank you for the possibility or the opportunity to talk to you. Have a good day.
Thank you. If this conversation stirred something in you, maybe a question that won't quiet down, maybe an uneasy feeling you can't quite name, great, that's the point. So don't scroll past it, follow it, see where the echoes lead. And you can find them in my archives on YouTube and on Substack. There you find the threads connecting what the headlines keep apart: politics, propaganda, psychology, and power. Go there if you're done consuming and ready to start seeing. Because understanding the present always begins with recognizing how the past keeps rewriting the script.